The first reports came from the edge of the empire, far from Tenochtitlan, along the Gulf Coast in the provinces of Cuetlaxtlan and Toctepec. Patrols along the shoreline watched canoe routes and kept track of smugglers and traders. They were not expecting strangers. In 1517, messengers described large houses floating on the sea, referring to the ships of Francisco Hernández de Córdoba's expedition. They noted cloth sails, tall masts, and men with faces like lime dust. These details entered provincial reports long before they reached the imperial court. But the first sightings were not treated as omens. They were treated as intelligence. Coastal officials sent structured reports to supervisors in Chempoala and Nautla. Object names, numbers of vessels, and directions were recorded. At this stage, the Aztec state believed the strangers were another coastal trading people. Strange, yes, but not supernatural. Tenochtitlan had one of the most complex courier systems in the world. Tamalti runners could bring news from the coast to the capital in 2 days. By 1518, these networks carried more detailed descriptions: metal helmets, shining weapons, animals that carried men, referring to horses, though this early description was confused and imprecise. Reports also mentioned fighting. Juan de Grijalva's 1518 expedition clashed with Maya forces at Champoton and then moved north. News of violence traveled faster than stories of trade. When these dispatches reached the Imperial Council, they were cross-checked with long-distance merchants, the Pochteca, whose testimony carried legal weight. Their statements matched the earlier reports: foreigners with powerful weapons, organized, disciplined, and traveling along the coast with clear intent. So by the time Cortes left Cuba in early 1519, Montezuma already possessed nearly 2 years of fragmented but credible intelligence. When the expedition of Hernán Cortés appeared on the coast of Yucatan and then moved to San Juan de Ulúa, Aztec observers took notes on everything: the number of ships, the shape and construction, the mobility of horses, the sound and smoke of firearms. These observations were not mystical. They were attempts to place new military technology into known categories. Meanwhile, Montezuma's advisors disagreed. Some referenced older cycles of return, including the figure of Seacatl Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl. Others, mainly military officials, warned against reading cosmic meaning into battlefield facts. This internal debate mattered. It slowed decision-making. Montezuma requested more reports, more detail, more corroboration. The court responded with standard Aztec procedure: send trained observers to gather close-range intelligence, sometimes disguised as merchants. Their findings were blunt. The foreigners were establishing alliances. They were armed. They were not leaving. The turning point came with the fall of Chempoala into alliance with Cortes. Couriers brought news that the Totonacs, long resentful of tribute demands, had invited the Spaniards into their city. This was unprecedented. Foreigners were not just passing ships, they were becoming players inside Aztec political territory. Montezuma's circle now had to consider a new possibility. Not divine visitors, not merchants, but political actors capable of weaponizing local grievances. When Cortes destroyed his own ships at Villarica, Aztec observers reported it immediately. Destroying vessels meant permanence, staying, advancing inland. This changed everything. The empire began reorganizing defensive positions. Garrisons at Tlacopan, Cholula, and Tlalmanalco were placed on alert. Merchants traveling into Tlaxcala reported that the Republic was preparing for war against the newcomers. Montezuma dispatched envoys with gifts, gold, feathers, textiles, a diplomatic measure to stall movement and buy time. But the most important realization had already occurred. The Aztecs now knew the newcomers were not temporary. They were an emerging rival force inside the Valley of Mexico's political system. The intelligence was fragmented but accurate enough. Foreign weapons, foreign tactics, alliances forming, inland advance underway. This was the final intelligence picture before Cortes entered the valley. The reports kept coming, faster now, more desperate, as the strangers moved beyond the coast and into the heart of the empire. And at the center of it all was an emperor caught between faith, statecraft, and the collapse of reliable information. In the months before the Spaniards entered the Valley of Mexico, Emperor Montezuma II governed an empire that was outwardly strong, but internally strained. Tribute still flowed into Tenochtitlan, the markets were full, and ceremonies continued, yet the political climate around him had begun to shift. Provincial governors reported rising discontent, especially in regions resentful of heavy tribute demands. Long-standing enemies like Tlaxcala remained defiant. Montezuma understood these pressures well, but the arrival of foreign visitors with unfamiliar weapons suddenly magnified every existing weakness. Information reached him unevenly. Some messages arrived from coastal officials who insisted the newcomers were simply dangerous men with superior weapons. Others came from priests and court scholars who argued these events matched old cycles recorded in temple manuscripts. They feared these strangers might be tied to returning figures from earlier eras. Montezuma did not fully commit to either explanation. Instead, he hesitated, asked for more reports, and requested further detail. The empire's normal decision-making process began slowing at the moment where most clarity was needed. Inside the palace, Montezuma's authority was still immense. Yet his council grew increasingly divided. Military leaders pushed for decisive action, recommending a rapid deployment of armies to contain the foreigners before they moved inland. Religious officials advised restraint, warning that attacking potentially divine visitors could bring cosmic disaster. Nobles from tributary cities added another layer of complication, each with their own regional concerns. These conflicting interpretations forced Montezuma to balance political realities with spiritual obligations. In an empire where religion and governance were deeply intertwined, hesitation became dangerous. Meanwhile, the foreigners advanced. Reports arrived describing their alliances with the Totonacs. Others warned that the strangers were moving toward Tlaxcala, a city that had resisted Aztec rule for generations. When word reached Tenochtitlan that fighting had broken out between Tlaxcalan forces and the Spaniards, the court watched closely. If Tlaxcala defeated the newcomers, the threat might end on its own. But if the strangers prevailed, they would become far more dangerous. When runners finally delivered the news that the visitors had survived the battles and even reached an agreement with Tlaxcala, Montezuma understood the strategic picture had changed completely. His next move was diplomatic. He sent envoys with gifts, gold, feathers, and fine clothing, meant to demonstrate the empire's wealth and to encourage the strangers to remain at distance. At the same time, he attempted to gather more intelligence through merchants, spies, and friendly city-states. The reports that returned were troubling. The foreigners were accompanied by large indigenous armies. They displayed a confidence that suggested long-term plans, and their leaders demanded direct communication with Montezuma himself. Inside the palace, the emperor began to withdraw. Spanish accounts describe him as fearful, but indigenous sources portray a ruler facing an impossible situation. Direct confrontation risked losing the capital. Welcoming the visitors risked losing authority. Every option carried enormous danger. Montezuma chose delay. He hoped that careful diplomacy, strategic gift-giving, and time might change the course of events. He also hoped the strangers might turn back of their own accord, satisfied with riches and tribute. But the pace of events continued to accelerate. more couriers reported that the Spaniards were marching toward Cholula, a sacred city closely tied to Montezuma's authority. If the strangers controlled Cholula, they could control the main routes into the valley. This news forced Montezuma into a narrower set of choices. He ordered further envoys to intercept the visitors and attempt to contain them diplomatically. He also tasked his generals with preparing contingency plans, though he avoided issuing direct orders for full-scale war. By the time the Spaniards reached the outskirts of the valley, Montezuma's world had shrunk to a series of increasingly constrained decisions.